Hi, thank you so much for joining us at the last meeting of the fall speaker series of the Future Security Initiative. For those joining us for the first time, we are a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. We work on a variety of research projects and publications. We have an MA in global security. We do events that are part of our public outreach like this one. And thank you for joining us. We're really thrilled tonight to have Roberto Patiño with us. His talk is This is Venezuela's Moment. It Needs the World's Help. And that title is actually from a New York Times opinion piece that Roberto wrote shortly before the Venezuelan elections this past summer. And it holds true today, the points that he brought out. Roberto's a social entrepreneur and a former leader in the Venezuelan student democracy movement. He's the founder of two organizations, Mi Convive and Alimenta la Solidaridad, that works in 240 vulnerable communities, empowering thousands of women volunteers to feed and assist children. He holds a master's in public policy from Harvard University and a BS in manufacturing engineering from the Universidad Simon Bolivar. We're really thrilled to have Roberto with us. The way we're going to run this evening is Roberto will talk for a little bit, provide a brief overview of the situation in Venezuela, the democracy movement, where things stand right now, and then we'll just begin our conversation. So thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be with you here and with your audience in this very prestigious webinar series that you've been organizing. It's an honor for me to participate. So I'll start just by sharing a little bit about the situation in Venezuela and also about the work that I've been doing there. And then, of course, I would love to engage in a conversation with you and respond to any of the questions the audience might have. So Venezuela, for those that don't know the country that well, is a South American country that was the richest country in Latin America for most of the 20th century. The reason is that in the 1920s, being a rural country, oil was found in large quantities, and this created a boom, an economic boom that was led mostly by American companies, Standard Oil, and then when it was broken, the ExxonMobil and Chevron and all ConocoPhillips, all the big American oil companies had a presence in Venezuela, and Venezuela became a reliable provider of oil and resources for the Western Hemisphere, even during the Second World War. And also Venezuela became a magnet for immigrants that were coming from different parts of the Western Hemisphere, mostly. For example, hundreds of thousands of people from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy came to Venezuela when after the war there in Europe. Also, we had a significant population coming from Lebanon and obviously from different parts of Latin America, from Colombia mostly, but also from other countries that were suffering in the 80s and 70s and 80s from very bloody dictatorships. People came to Venezuela as political refugees from Argentina, from Chile, from Peru, from different parts of the world. For example, in my own personal case, on my father's side, they came to Venezuela in the 50s, my grandparents from Costa Rica. On my mother's side, they came at the beginning of the 20th century from Switzerland. So we have a very diverse population in Venezuela. And it's a country that from the 1950s became a democracy. One of the few democracies in the region, was one of the democracies that performed the best in terms of increasing access to education, to health. But it had a very significant problem, which is the reliance on oil exports as the main source of the economy and of public resources as well. So obviously, Venezuela started suffering from the Dutch disease, which is this problem on which economies that depend on a single crop a single export, become more and more or less and less competitive to produce other stuff. So everything is imported in the country, and obviously you're very exposed to the changes in prices. So the system in Venezuela in the 80s and 90s, when I was born in 1988, was already cracking, because there was a lot of corruption in the political system, but also oil prices had decreased and the system was no longer performing for the majority of people. And that's when people from the military, led by Hugo Chavez, who was a lieutenant back then, tried a coup d'etat against the system. And they failed. They failed in 1992. I was 4 years old. But he went to prison, and he was released. In 1998, he ran for president and won. He won on a platform of going against corruption, on going against inequality, trying to include people. And we've been reading a lot about how democracies are being undermined from within institutions, using institutions to go against the institutions themselves. And Venezuela is exhibit A in a way, because Chavez came to power, winning an election, but then started to consolidate an authoritarian system that obviously depended a lot on oil. He was lucky that at the beginning of the decade of the 2000s, we had the commodity boom in the world, and oil prices skyrocket and allowed him to have a lot of public spending that obviously generated high levels of popularity for himself and his party. So he won elections, but he was increasingly co-opting the state and trying to suppress civil society. So in 2007, Chavez decided to go against the media and started shutting down the media and tried to reform the constitution for him to have the capacity to re-elect himself permanently. And that's when we went to the streets as a student movement. I was 18 years old back then. My first year studying manufacturing engineering in a public university. I was not planning to be involved in political issues, but obviously the circumstances of my country falling apart made me want to try to do something, like many other young people who went to the streets. And one thing led me to the other. I was elected president of the student body. And then I was invited to lead the youth for the presidential campaign of the opposition against Chavez in 2012. And during that experience, something that really shocked me was to see how the levels of distrust of the majority of the people with the political system. We would knock on doors with people and we would say, we're trying to bring change. And people were very skeptical of that. And that made me take a step back and think how I wanted to affect change. And that's why I started two projects in the social entrepreneurship side. The first one was called Mi Convive. The idea was that I went to the communities where Chavez was most popular. Back then in 2012, Venezuela was really polarized, not only in terms of political ideology, but also social class. So people from the middle class, urban areas that were better off economically would vote for the opposition, and the people who were in the rural areas and also the urban poor would vote for Chavismo. Might sound familiar, some of the things that I'm saying, because obviously we've been seeing in different contexts around the world, including the US, how polarization has increased in the past years. So back then I decided to try to reach out to the other side, to cross the aisle in a way. So I created this NGO and started visiting communities that would vote for Chavez by 90% of the vote. So I had already had some visibility in the media and social media, so people knew I was the opposition. But I would tell them that I was coming without an agenda. It was not about an election. I just wanted to work with people and try to understand where they were coming from and why they were supporting that project. Why I wanted to explain myself, why I thought it was not in the best interest of our country, and try to do some projects together, show that we could actually work together on concrete stuff, which at the beginning was violence reduction programs focused on youth. Then I had the opportunity to do my master's degree at the Kennedy School and decided to return to Venezuela. And it was already in Venezuela, the economy, after Chavez died and Maduro got elected in a very contested election, and the economy had already collapsed. And I started seeing a lot of children in the communities that I was working in asking me for food. And that really shocked me to the core. I could not be indifferent with with children who were hungry. So I pivoted and said to my team, look, we have to keep doing violence reduction programs, but we also have to do something for this. So we started a soup kitchen program. And this soup kitchen program called Alimenta la Solidaridad, or Feed the Solidarity, was basically a program in which we would provide the ingredients, and people would, in the communities, would do all the work and would provide the infrastructure and the organizing for the community, the soup kitchens to work. At the beginning, I had no funding. I just asked family and friends to help me out to try to get this off the ground. And obviously, we started inviting people to see the work that we were doing. We started posting on social media, and it rapidly generated momentum. A lot of Venezuelans outside of the country would send support for us to grow our project. And also we started receiving ambassadors. The ambassador of France, of Germany, would come to the communities and would offer help. And that's how we started to grow. And it's now the largest humanitarian effort in Venezuela by Venezuelan civil society. It has served in the past 8 years over 20 million hot meals to hungry children. But this has happened in a context of a lot of political repression by the regime. In myself, I've had in 2 occasions, including now, arrest warrants by the regime that they have come after us. And this year was a very important year for the democracy movement in Venezuela, because we reached a boiling point in terms of the possibility of demonstrating that the Venezuelan people really want change. So for those of you that don't know, Venezuela, it's paradoxically has the largest oil reserves in the world, has a lot of land for agriculture, has beautiful nature that could be a great source of tourism for the country, but it has also the worst migration crisis in the world. So even higher than the Syrian migration crisis in Venezuela. In the past years, 8 million have left the country. This is 25% of the population. And it's a combination, of course, of the economic collapse, the humanitarian situation, and the political repression. So the majority of Venezuelans have left the country for other South American countries. Colombia, for example, has 2.5 million Venezuelan forced migrants and refugees. Peru has 1 million, Chile 800,000, Brazil over 600,000. And obviously, in the past 3 years, also a lot of Venezuelans have been migrating to the US. So in the past 3 years, the 3 nationalities that would account for the majority of the encounters at the southern border of the US would be Venezuelans, Mexicans, and Guatemalans. Obviously, Cubans and Haitians are also a significant population that have been migrating to the US. So this year we had a presidential election. It was a presidential election that we knew was not going to be free and fair. But we thought it was an opportunity to really demonstrate that even with a very unbalanced electoral field, we could win that election. We had a primary last year. We selected a leader for the opposition. A woman named Maria Corina Machado won easily that primary, but she was barred from running by the regime. She selected a substitute who was also barred from running with no justification. And then a second substitute was allowed to register. He is a former diplomat called Edmundo Gonzalez. He was allowed to run. The opposition didn't have one opportunity to present its ideas on the media in Venezuela. The only way to get the word out about what the opposition is about was through social media. We have over 2,000 political prisoners in Venezuela now. And it was a very difficult situation with no international or strong international observation missions that were not allowed by the regime, or they control all the institutions. And despite all of that, the opposition won in a landslide the election in July. And not only we won the election by a landslide, but we have proofs that we won the election by a landslide, because how the electoral system in Venezuela works, it's every electoral table would produce a tally that the opposition has a right to have. And when the regime realized the scale of the defeat that they were facing, over 30 points, the opposition had over 63% of the vote. The regime had barely 30% of the vote, like 2-to-1 proportion. They try to prevent the opposition from having the tallies, but a lot of people, even from the regime, disobeyed that order, and from the military disobeyed that order, and the opposition was able to collect 83% of the tallies that show that even with the remainder 17% that we had, we couldn't collect. If Maduro had 100% of those votes, he would still be very far from Edmundo Gonzalez. So that obviously shows that the opposition won. And just last week, Secretary Blinken recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the president-elect of Venezuela. And it's all over the world, leaders have been calling Maduro to release the tallies. That he claims he won the election, but he wouldn't present any proofs. So he lacks the credibility, obviously, and the only people that recognized Maduro as the winner, as you can imagine, were the Russians, the Chinese, and other authoritarian countries around the world. So Maduro has been from the left, used to have the support of Petro in Colombia, of Lula in Brazil, but even them have said that without proving that they won, they can't recognize Maduro as a legitimate winner of that election. So the next key date for Venezuela is January 10th. That's when the new president should be inaugurated. And this moment, we need to put a lot of pressure on Maduro, on the regime, to accept a political transition. The Venezuelan people have been repressed. The Venezuelan people have been imprisoned, have been exiled, have been killed by the regime. And even after so many years of a very dark situation, we have continued to fight peacefully for our democracy. And we are asking the world to support us in that effort and try to put pressure on Maduro to accept that things can no longer continue in the same direction.
Thank you so much, Roberto. That was a really helpful and also heartfelt explanation of what's going on in this complicated country. Just for everybody's reference, I mean, your point about the number of Venezuelans that have fled the country, it's as if as many as 80 million Americans were to leave the country. It's sort of unimaginable, frankly, from a position where we sit, what it feels like. And I'm wondering, just to take a step back from the issue of the elections for a second, what does it feel like to be a Venezuelan thinking about and confronting a situation where 25% of the country has actually left Venezuela because of the crisis in the country?
Yeah, it's a horrible tragedy, right? Because as you can imagine, Venezuelans, like many Latin Americans, we're a very family-oriented culture. And when you talk about 25% of the people leaving the country, you're talking about families being torn apart. People who have not seen each other in many years, people who had to say goodbye to a grandparent through a Zoom call, a mother that has not met or grandmother that has not met in person their grandkids that now might be 6-year-old. So it's a very and we're about this week in the US is Thanksgiving, right? So it's imagine what it would mean for some of you not to spend Thanksgiving with your family in the past 5 years, 6 years. And this is what has happened to Venezuelans. You know, our most important holiday is Christmas, and you know it's a very sad time in Venezuela now, because people have been separated because of this crisis, and in a way the narrative that the opposition has been pushing for and that we have been pushing for some years now is that the fight for democracy in Venezuela is not only about democracy, it's about reuniting the Venezuelan family. It's about being together again. And that's only in the context of having a political transition.
So, what do you think are the more meaningful levers of power on, say, the US side to press for a different outcome in January 10th?
So the U.S. Has sanctions on Maduro, individual sanctions. There's a bounty on Maduro's head by the State Department. There are judicial processes. Maduro and his cronies have been indicted by the Justice Department in the U.S. And I think for Maduro and his cronies to accept a transition, there needs to be an off-ramp. And that's what the article that you were mentioning about that I wrote for the New York Times was about when you corner someone, they become more and more aggressive, right? So you have to actually show them an exit. And I think that's part of what the US could do, try to do that in a credible manner. And, some people can say, well, Maduro is not going to accept that. And it might be the case. But, a lot of the authoritarian regimes in history have collapsed when there is infighting in the regime, when the different factions in the regime start to compete with each other. And I think if the US and the Latin American countries, Europe, helps factions of the regime see that there's a better future for them too, if they accept the political transition, I think that could trigger a lot of pressure on Maduro to move in that direction.
I mean, most of the actions, like the Bolivar Act, interestingly, proposed by both a Republican and a Democratic representative of the House, uh, puts more pressure, more sanctions, more, mechanisms of making things difficult for the ruling party and the cronies, as you say. What do you mean by an off ramp? Because it seems like most of the talk in the U.S. and most of the policy efforts are punishing and sanctions.
Well, I think needs to be a combination of the two, right? You need the carrot and you need the stick. And obviously, I know that for electoral purposes, it's much better to be perceived as tough against the dictator. And we appreciate that solidarity, of course. But you also need to have diplomacy because it's the only way out. The only way out is for a political transition to happen. It's very significant, as you were mentioning, the Bolivar Act was one of the proponents is the incoming national security advisor,
Mike
Waltz.
Waltz, yeah.
Yeah, he's one of the persons who's been proposing that. And you have Marco Rubio as the incoming Secretary of State. And I think that's the good side of those appointments is that there's going to be intention. They care about the region and they will speak about the region. The challenge for them is how to draft a policy that doesn't repeat in a way the same outcome than we've seen with Cuba, right? Which is a protracted crisis on which years pass and nothing changes. So I think there needs to be creative thinking and very targeted pressure to people who are doing bad stuff in Venezuela, but also offering an off-ramp to change the calculus for some of those factions within the regime.
I mean, the Cuba example is an excellent one because think of all the years we've seen of the most hard positions against the Cuban regime with the greatest degree of sanctions and with the most intense sort of negative talk. So using that as what the US should not do, what do you see as the effective carrots that could be offered? Obviously, the sanctions are, we know what those might look like, and the Cuba example provides that model. But what's the model for carrots? Like what could be offered to Maduro and his cronies that would make a transition appealing to them?
Well, I think first of all, they're never going to leave power if they believe that the outcome for them and their families is that they're going to be deported or being imprisoned in the US. So that's the starting point. We've seen a lot of statements by, US officials in the Trump 1 administration, also people in the Biden administration, saying stuff like, the only thing that we can negotiate with Maduro is what food does he want in the airplane that is going to take him out and bring him here to the US to be imprisoned. So that's, that's maybe it's a good tagline. It's a good tweet. You're going to get a lot of likes, but it's not realistic in a way. How you forced him to go outside of the country if what you're offering them is prison, right? So from my view, that needs to be part of the conversation. It's a difficult conversation about transitional justice, for example. And there's examples around the world that have created processes in which people who committed crimes, obviously there's a line, people who committed crimes against humanity, grave violations of human rights, and can be demonstrated that they were the person who were ordering that, cannot be absolved. But even in a context like the one in South Africa, you saw that a lot of people people understood that the only way out is to live together, right? The one thing that we are not going to accept as Venezuelans is to live together with Maduro as king. Why? We're not going to accept that. In Venezuela, the sovereign is the Venezuelan people. And the Venezuelan people spoke loudly and clearly in July that we want change. So we might have to accept that Maduro and his cronies, some of them might have a political role in the future in Venezuela. They might stay in Congress, for example, like what happened in Colombia with the FARC. But we're not going to accept them as, rulers of our country, that they don't have the legitimacy to rule our country. So those are the difficult trade-offs that we need to think about. And obviously we need courageous leaders who are willing to speak the truth, because this is the truth. It's easier just to be tough and just allow time to go by.
Yeah. So what do you, perhaps another approach would be something you suggested, which would be a more coordinated, unified effort with Latin American allies. I mention that because maybe the U.S. is not the strongest partner for laying out the plan. And would you think it would be useful to pull in, Brazil with the government of Lula, or again Colombia, or any of the other Latin American countries, all of which have their own particular relations with Venezuela, and frankly, like you say, are busy hosting large numbers of Venezuelans, in many cases far greater numbers than the U.S. does.
Yeah. So I just finished a study on the Venezuelan migrants and also Venezuelans who have plans to migrate. And I'll give you a very staggering number. 3 million Venezuelans, 2 million in country, and 1 million who are already in other South American countries want to migrate in 2025.
You mean back to Venezuela?
No.
Oh, you mean want to leave Venezuela?
2 million more. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So this problem is not going anywhere. And it's the most important strategic and geopolitical issue in Latin America. It's destabilizing the countries. I attended an event where the president of Chile was speaking, and he said, we already have 800,000 Venezuelans. We cannot take one more. And I approached him after the event and said, buckle up, because people are coming. People are desperate in Venezuela for political change, for an opportunity. And there was the hope that if we win the election, it would trigger change. And if Maduro prevails using force and suppressing the people, migration will only get worse. And we know that this was a very important topic in the US election. We heard now President-elect Trump speak a lot about Venezuelan migrants in the US. And we expect probably that the border will get more strict in the US. But that means that it's going to be more people for other Latin American countries. That doesn't mean that people will stay in Venezuela. I don't think so. So this is going to continue to be a very important problem. And that's why it's a good idea to try to generate a coalition between the US, Europe, Latin America to try to solve the problem. Solve the problem by giving Maduro an exit, giving them a way out that they can accept, and that it doesn't mean that it's the end of the world for them, but it's the opening of a new chapter for Venezuela.
So can you
Remember,
yeah.
there's
Mhm.
just to finish there. Remember that obviously we have spoilers in here, right? And we have people who don't want Venezuela to change. The Cubans, for example, have been empowering the Venezuelan regime with a lot of technology to spy on the opposition, to spy on the military, to spy on Chavistas themselves, to suppress any dissent before it can flourish. The first, government to recognize Maduro's victory was Russia. In the recent BRICS summit in Kazan, Maduro traveled there, and Putin received him and invited him to be part of BRICS. And Lula blocked that. Lula said, no, we won't accept Venezuela as part of the BRICS, which was an important moment as well, because it's an important signal that, that behavior is not acceptable. And if Maduro prevails using force, you can imagine that other authoritarians in the continent may be thinking, if he could pull it off, why couldn't I? If people vote something, but you can just say anything you want, then so be it, right? So it's a very bad precedent in a country that it's, as I was saying, the situation in the country is destabilizing the region.
So to get back to this point about carrots, can you concretize what would be appealing to convince Maduro and his inside group to leave power? Would they have to leave the country? Would they have to receive amnesty? Would they have to receive various kinds of modes of protection? In a really concrete way, what could be offered? What could advance that process?
Yeah, there are many formulas, let's say. Obviously, for me, the ideal would be for them to leave the country so we can start fresh. I don't think that's the most likely scenario. Why? Because when you see other examples in history, for example, Pinochet in Chile, when he exited power, he stayed in the government as head of the military, but then he left the country and he was imprisoned outside of the country. So nowadays, you have to be very stupid if you're an authoritarian to believe that you will be safe in other country where you have no control over their judicial system. So if I'm trying to think on their shoes, they would want to stay in Venezuela, having the capacity to implode the system if the opposition goes after them, right? So they could be, there's some people been talking that there could be an arrangement on which if you are an ex-president, you get a seat at Congress for life that
Like
gives
Pinochet.
yeah, it gives you immunity and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And at least I would be very open to have those kind of conversations, because for me, the most important thing is to turn the page. And the most important thing for me is to reunite the Venezuelan family. And the most important for me is to rebuild Venezuela and show the world that what Venezuelans are capable of. It's very sad that we've lost so many talented people. The outgoing or the president emeritus of MIT is a Venezuelan who was trained in Venezuela in a public university. Rafael Reif is his name. So, like him, which is obviously a symbol, there are many Venezuelans who've been successful in the US, in Europe, in Latin American countries. And I'm sure that if we achieve a transition in Venezuela, we can rebuild our country.
Do you think then, say, one concrete idea would be some form of amnesty associated with a political position? So the senator for life idea. That's
I
one.
think that's one idea. Yeah. I think that what's not negotiable for the opposition is to say Maduro is going to stay in power. He's going to be, a little bit like what happened in Zimbabwe, because we can also learn from other contexts, on which Mugabe lost the election, didn't want to go out, and then he said, "No, I'll stay president, but I'll allow the opposition to
Yeah.
take some cabinets, to be cabinet members." And of course, it was a really bad deal for the country and for society, because he made the opposition complicit on his corruption, on his incapacity to solve problems of the people. But the opposition really never had power in Zimbabwe. So I think the opposition in Venezuela should not accept any deal on which Maduro stays at top, Maduro lost. Maduro has to give up power.
Is the
And
Democratic
from that
opposition
standpoint, it's good.
is the Democratic opposition unified enough to cut deals with the Maduro administration?
I think it is now. I think the opposition is behind the leadership of Machado and Gonzalez. And I think if there was a deal to be made, Maria Corina Machado, has always been considered a hardliner, a person who's been very strong against the regime. And she has said publicly that she's willing to entertain the idea of reaching an agreement. Obviously, there's a problem of trust in Venezuela between the different parties. And that's why I think also the international community could play a role in helping out, bring people together and be guarantors of any deal that can be reached. I've told the Brazilians, for example, they have been developing a very close relationship with the Chinese, and we're seeing more and more Chinese investments in South America. Recently, there was a port opened in Peru, over $3 billion, that investment. We know the Chinese are investing a lot of money in Argentina, in mining, in Chile. They have very significant business with Brazil, with Colombia. And, you have to ask yourself, and I was telling the Brazilians this, you have to ask yourself, why is China sabotaging the possibility of change in Venezuela and destabilizing the region with it? The only reason is that they do it because of their rivalry with the US. And they think, the opposition is pro-US, the regime is pro-China, so we are with the regime. Very stupid assessment, very basic. And what they need to understand is that by supporting a regime that it's suppressing the people, that it's not complying with the rules of Venezuela, it's not only about democracy, which I fully understand that they don't care about, but Venezuela has its own rules on how to decide leadership, and Maduro did not comply with those rules, and now it's destabilizing the region, and it will continue to do so. So the Chinese should not be, supporting Maduro if they want to be good partners to Brazil, to Argentina, to Peru, on which they have much bigger investments and interests than in Venezuela.
So in some peace processes and some transitions have been assisted by what have been called like a group of friends, states that have helped coordinate the
Right.
process. Guatemala's an example, Salvador. Um, if you were to construct or name that group of friends, which states would be on that?
Look, I think obviously Latin American countries are very important for Venezuela, our neighbors, and you know, also our traditional and hemispheric partners, the US, Europe. But Maduro has been saying repeatedly that he wanted to join the BRICS, right? And I think he says that because he ideologically subscribes to the idea of the multipolar world and trying to, the anti-imperialistic narrative that they've had from the beginning. And I think that this is an opportunity to tell, and this is Brazil, India, at least South Africa, and even China. I don't think Russia will ever play a constructive role. But even China, I think, with the argument of stability for South America, could see that they don't win really anything by supporting Maduro. So, maybe they can also be part of it. India allegedly is a democracy. They're buying a lot of Venezuelan oil still. South Africa, for some a weird reason that they have a connection to Cuba, historical connection with Cuba, and they are still supporting Maduro. It's absurd. It's really absurd. So I do think there's an opportunity to try to use some of the leverage that the countries of the region have and show that this crisis is a lose-lose crisis for everybody, and this could be an opportunity for international collaboration to help a country get back on its feet. And it's a country that can help the world in many ways, producing food, oil, etc.
Did Venezuelans still refer to themselves as Chavistas?
I don't think so. I think the ones who are with Maduro, yes. which is probably 20% of the population.
And do
Uh,
you because when Hugo Chavez came into power, and for some of his years of rule, he was, a popular figure, both a populist and a popular figure. Does that popularity, does that sense of sort of, reconstructing Venezuelan society, does that resonate with Venezuelans given the severity of the crisis?
I think it used to resonate. I think Venezuelans, obviously, it's kind of, and it's part of the challenge with this type of authoritarian movements that are destroying democracy from within, is that they say some truths. It's obvious that Venezuela is a very unequal society. It's obvious that there was a lot of corruption, but now it's even worse. So I do think that when we project to the future, the system that Venezuela needs is completely different, and it's the opposite of what Chavez was proposing for Venezuela in a way. We need to have a rule of law. We need to encourage private investments. We need to have, people coming into the formal sectors of the economy. We need to produce other stuff. We need investments. And obviously that's completely the opposite of what Chavez was doing, was basically expropriating everything and trying to make the state the only game in town.
And is there a sense, though? I mean, so many of the objective conditions of Venezuela show clear failure. The fact that Venezuelans are fleeing the country out of desperation, that alone, tells you how hard things are on the ground. Really, just objectively, leaving aside, political affiliations. How does that feel on the ground? I mean, what is it like when you talk to the supporters of Maduro, say in the various, I'm not sure if you do anymore, but when you were doing work, with
Yeah.
civil society groups, you were probably dealing with some number of people who supported the regime. How does that make sense on the ground, uh, given how desperate the situation is?
Well, there's fewer and fewer people that would support Maduro now. Some people still depend on the state, obviously, and that's a reason for why they would support the system. And they have full control of the media, so all the time they're trying to create a narrative on which, the migration crisis, the economic crisis, the service collapse, everything is because there are sanctions from the US. So the US is to blame for all the problems of Venezuela, even though sanctions came well after there was already a humanitarian and migration crisis. I started a humanitarian program in 2016, and there were no sanctions in 2016, and there were already children asking for food. So it's just not real. It's not true. But it's if they have all the weight of the state pushing for this narrative for people who are in a very desperate position, some people buy it, but it's definitely a minority.
Mhm. And what would you say if and you may even have this opportunity, if you could set the stage for the incoming Trump administration for what it should do concretely to advance peace and bring about a change? Interestingly, the administration won't begin until after the inauguration in Venezuela, right? If
Yeah,
a week and a half
correct.
after. But what would you say, like concretely, what should the steps be?
Well, I would say that in terms of increasing pressure on the regime, they should follow the money, right? And they should put targeted pressure on people who are enabling the regime, who are the front men of the regime. So increasing the cost of keeping the repression on Venezuelan people. But at the same time, I think they should send a very concrete, high-level offer to try to solve this problem, but with a political transition that can be inclusive. And maybe there was a lot of talk in Venezuela after the election that it was very difficult, that there was going to be a negotiation before the US selected its president, right? Because the regime thought, well, if they made a deal with Biden, then Trump could come in and just reverse that. So, but now that that variable has been, cleared, and if Trump offers a way out that can be a win-win for everybody. Because if Venezuelans, if we have change, it's the only way that Venezuelans will want to return to our country, and
So
that's what we
there's
want.
there's around 700,000 Venezuelans now in the U.S. Either here legally through the temporary protected status, or in the process of trying to resolve their TPS, or in some other indeterminate situation, right? So um, how do you think the Trump administration should manage the Venezuelans who are here, many of whom legally and others in a sort of legal process? The plan right now, or at least some of the discussion, has been to revoke TPS. That isn't a clear policy decision, but that's on the agenda. How do you think the presence of so many Venezuelans, relatively recent arrivals, should be managed by the Trump administration to facilitate this sort of transition in Venezuela?
Look, obviously, what I expect is for them to be treated humanely. People are not in the US purely by choice. People were forced out of Venezuela because of the political and economic situation. And my understanding is that the majority of them have either claimed asylum
Yeah.
or asked for TPS. So they cannot be called illegals. It's not true. They are in a process. They have not had a decision that asks them to leave the country. And you have to consider, if that program, the TPS, were to be subject of revision, where would people go if you don't solve the political situation in Venezuela? I would actually frame it differently. I would say, if the situation in Venezuela is solved, which means a political transition, I believe that a lot of people, and I've seen that in polls, that I saw a poll 6 months ago that said that 65% of Venezuelans in the US say that if there's political change in Venezuela, they would want to return. So it would be a voluntary process of
An
people.
interesting point, though, is that actually is how TPS is theoretically structured, as a temporary
Mhm.
protection
Yeah,
until a situation is resolved, whether it's a situation from a natural disaster,
yeah,
conflict. Um, that isn't how it's played out, as the critics of TPS have often made out, but it might be an interesting strategy for the Trump administration to suggest that the true structure of TPS could be realized through the policy you are advocating.
yeah,
Um,
correct.
and now, what about the financial contributions? Do you think that the international community, maybe led by the U.S., maybe led by other players, needs to offer something concrete for reconstruction, or maybe even some sort of concrete benefit for Maduro and his cronies to facilitate this sort of transition?
I think the first one, yes. I think, if also to put pressure on Maduro, we need the framing for me is how to increase the contradictions within the regime. And, there might be some people within the regime that are said about the economic situation, about the trajectory of the country. So I do think that part of the carrot that should be on the table is that the international community is willing to support Venezuela in rebuilding its economy, in rebuilding its institutions, in having the capacity of a functioning country. So I think that should be part of the offer that might also increase that pressure within the regime to accept a political transition on which institutions such as the military would have a lot to win. Um, but with respect to Maduro and his cronies, they have stolen a lot of money, ungodly amounts of money. Maduro, one of his closest confidants, who he named president of PDVSA, the oil company in Venezuela, last year, Tarek El Aissami, was imprisoned by Maduro himself. And Maduro accused him of stealing $3 billion. $3 billion with a B. The opposition believes that probably it's more around 15. And you say, how can they steal those amounts of money? Well, basically because you have so much oil in the black markets that it's being, traded in a very shady way. And they just claim sometimes that an oil cargo disappeared. So they're just imagine what it means to steal an oil cargo, a boat full of oil, you know? So I do believe that probably the incentives for Maduro and his cronies are not more money. I think it's more about their own personal security and what the future is for them and their social circles.
Do you think the democracy movement would accept a sort of broad amnesty that would protect members of the military, members of the inner circle, and others from accountability for a variety of violations and abuses?
I think it's a very hard pill to swallow, but if the Venezuelan pro-democracy movement is faced with a choice on whether accept some amnesties in exchange for real political change, I think the majority of people would accept that. And even I've spoken with people who had been political prisoners, people who have lost family members, and they said to me, you know, what we really expect is change in Venezuela. That's our country, that's our land, you know, that's what we care the most about.
Do you think there's any possibility for some kind of referendum in the style that occurred in Chile that was key to the delegitimization of the Pinochet regime?
I think already happened.
It happened.
It was the presidential election in July.
And
And the
do
interesting thing is that, you know, because of how the electoral system, it's a very paradoxical situation for Maduro, because the way Chavez would justify his authoritarian impulses would be because he said, I win elections. So we have the most robust electoral system in the world. And it was a system that was built with a lot of redundancies to know what really happened. And, you know, even when votes were counted, there would be announced publicly in each electoral table, and everybody would have a copy of the tally. So in Venezuela, everybody knows Maduro lost. Everybody. The people from the military that are stationed at each polling station listened to the results, you know, of that electoral table. And it was a landslide everywhere. So everybody knows he lost.
do
So
you think
that
then, do you think that that means that the fundamental situation because of this election over the summer has changed, that that
yeah,
served as something powerful for the next stage in the country's political
definitely, it's a turning point. I think nothing will be the same from now on, because even for the pro-democracy movement, you know, before the election, you could say it makes sense even with very bad conditions to participate, because this is a system with those redundancies. So the way they cheated before this election was just they would bar candidates from running, they would try to demobilize the opposition, demoralize, repress, and so on. But this time they went one step further. They made up numbers. They just made up numbers. Even though, and they, I think part of what has made the situation so difficult for them is that they never expected the opposition to have the proofs. But now we have them. We have the tallies, we have, you know, statistical models, we have a lot of robust evidence of what happened that day. And as I told you before, everybody knows what really happened. So it's going to be very hard for them to maintain some coherence as a group, you know, because they know Maduro lost. So in the fight between factions, why would they respect Maduro? He lost.
That sounds like a very powerful argument for this next stage that you're advocating, and that clearly sounds like maybe the only way forward for Venezuela. That's in such devastating situation. Any
Yeah.
final words for everybody, just about not just maybe about Venezuela, but about how Americans should understand Venezuela and its significance? Because let's be honest, in the current political climate, the discussion of Venezuela is focused almost exclusively on migration with a very negative turn, with the sense that those Venezuelans coming into the country present some core danger. And even the Democratic Party didn't really do a particularly interesting job of talking about Venezuela or really any of the sending countries as if they were unique places with their own challenges and with the suffering of people that leads them to leave. So, any thoughts about how to how to understand Venezuela differently in the American context?
Sure. So Venezuela has, and Venezuelans and Americans have always been friendly to each other, right? And we have a lot of things in common as peoples. For example, Venezuela's national sport is baseball, and the reason of that is obviously the oil fields, from the 1920s, and we have amazing baseball players in the major league in the U.S. And when you ask Venezuelans in polls what do they think of the U.S., they really like the U.S. There's a lot of values alignment with the U.S. The situation that we're going through, on which people have been forced to leave, is a situation that Venezuelans want reversed. Venezuelans, we love our country. We feel very proud of our country. We want to be in our country, the majority of us. Obviously, it comes to a point on which a lot of people have made, they married someone, they have their children, whatever, but there's a very strong emotional connection between Venezuelans and Venezuela. So, and I think we're very close geographically. If you take a flight from Caracas to Miami, which there hasn't been one in many years because of sanctions, it's only 2 hours and 50 minutes. And if you take a flight from Caracas to New York, it's only 4 hours and a half. So it's closer to go from Caracas to some parts of the US than, going from the East Coast to the West Coast. So I think there's a great opportunity for collaboration between Venezuela and the US. And obviously, the vast majority of Venezuelans are hardworking people who want to do things right. And if there, like in any society, some rotten apples, people that doesn't comply with the law or commit crimes, but the vast majority are not in that way. So I'm sad sometimes to hear the way Venezuelan migrants are portrayed, because I know many Venezuelan migrants, and I know they're trying to get ahead after being exposed, after suffering expulsion from our country. So, and we want to reclaim it, but we need help, and that's for me the final message. If Venezuela changes, it's not only a good development for Venezuelans, it will also be a great development for the Western Hemisphere and for the world.
Thank you so much, Roberto Patiño, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Have a good night.